up this morning that many of you were as well. And I think if you, in one way, distilled down what one of the most important things of his message were, is the understanding that comes from his culture of human beings are just one of the variety of living beings. We all come under the sun, we all have mothers, and the importance of connection. And he actually said, you know, why am I here? I'm here because Joel invited me. And I could say the same thing. I'm here because Michelle and Leanne invited me. And one of the things that seems to me in my couple of days with you that is the connection amongst every human being in this room that really matters is that we share a passion. We do what we do because it comes from someplace very deep inside. We call it different things. Some of us call it public participation. Some of it call it citizen involvement. Some of us call it citizen engagement, community engagement, and those distinctions matter in the exact work that we are doing. Some of us call it deliberative democracy. But the thread through all of it is, in fact, a commitment to ensure that every voice is heard. And the values I've heard in every breakout session I've gone to is a special emphasis of working to ensure that those voices that are not typically heard are in fact heard in the processes that we're designing, running, or helping teach community members how to design and run on their own. So it is in that context that I want to highlight a few macro trends that I think are important for us to begin to think about globally and to think about both how those trends impact the work we do and how we actually might make a contribution to affecting those trends. So I'm going to share a few that are in my heart and mind, but I'm actually also going to invite you to add to that list. The first, from my perspective, is particularly since the end of the 80s, we have witnessed the cry of people completely around the world for more freedom, dignity, and democracy. A signal moment was the fall of the Berlin Wall, followed closely behind by the end of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism in Europe. Not too long after that, the end of apartheid in South Africa, and most recently, the Arab Spring. So this has happened before in human history, but we're living through a time when people who have been in oppressive political or economic systems are coming together in whatever way they can to say enough. This is not how human beings should live. You live in a country, I live in a country that hasn't yet fully dealt with the way in which politics and social attitudes still oppress some peoples in our own countries. So the issue is far from finished in terms of global humanity, but we're in a different stage about that reality than we've been in for a while. The second macro trend is the migration of peoples worldwide. And dominantly those people are migrating to find a better life for themselves, for their families. And literally, most of the developed world is struggling deeply with how to respond to the entrance of those migrating people into social systems that I just acknowledged here and in my own country haven't yet dealt completely with the existing populations across the spectrum. Huge, huge issue worldwide. The next is climate change. And there were several really very powerful sessions on what some communities here in Australia are beginning to do to deal with adaptation. The next I'd mention is the increasing income and wealth gap in the most developed nations in the world. We have watched, if I just speak in my own country, in the last 20 years, the gap between the top earners and wealth in my nation to the lowest has increased by more than 40%. It's a stunning number, and exactly the opposite direction that is necessary for a healthy democracy. I don't know the figures in Australia, but I've read enough of your newspapers, I've looked at enough of your television that it's clearly happening here as well. The next is the dramatic decrease in people's trust in institutions. Dominic just had a beautiful slide in his presentation focusing on specifically the distrust in government. In the United States, the Gallup polling organization has been doing trust in institutions polling since the end of World War II. For the first time in the history of that polling, well, I'm going to go back, it's done every 4 years. 4 years ago when it was done, there was only one institution in which the American public still had more than 50% trust in it. So the rest, military, education, faith-based organizations, had all fallen below 50%. The single institution that was still above 50%, and when I tell you what it was, I think it will raise a question in your mind of, is that really an institution? But the last holdout was interpersonal relationships. Most people still trusted that if I told you I would do X, you could have confidence that I would actually do it. The last Gallup poll was released about 2 months ago. And in that case, even that fell below 50%. To me, what this tells us is we're living in a time when the institutional frameworks within which we live, and frankly, every person in the room is working to do something about what I'm about to say. The institutions were created during an earlier period of history when the assumptions about power, the assumptions about people were different. And therefore, we created hierarchical institutions to keep a lot of power here and a very little power here. Obviously, we're now living in an age, and the piece, most people talk about technology is changing that. Of course, technology is changing that. But the element that I think we need to think a little bit more about that's also having a profound effect, I think if you take the mass of human consciousness, who we are collectively, our consciousness about what kind of organizations we need to live in is ahead of our capacity to create the institutions. You following me? And partly it's because the old ones want to keep the power. But more of us are ready for a different organizational framework. That means, if that's true, if what I believe it deeply, if it is true, then we ought to be able to find, and again, several of you whose programs I were in, you're actually doing this, but you're doing it in a specific context. Part of the challenge I would put out to us is how do we bring together people to start to actually define what those institutions would look like. Something about us as human beings, we can't take actions to produce change unless we have seen, so to speak, what the change looks like. How do we start to think about some convenings that actually take on the question, what would a different governance structure in the public sector actually look like? The way Dominic called it in the last meeting was, how would we institutionalize public participation? I would take it one step further. What would a parliament look like that actually integrated public voice into its institutional framework? Do Do you hear how that's a different question? Okay. I'm going to be in serious trouble because I didn't mean to say this much about each one of these macro trends. So the next one. An incredible shift in the balance of power between government on the one hand and finance and big business, a la the corporate world, on the other hand. Government was the only institution so far we've come up with that was supposed to protect the common good. If we continue on the trend that we're in, where finance and corporate interests have so much more power than does government to allocate resources as a key one, then who and how and where is the common good going to be protected? The last one I want to say, in most places in the developed world, we're still having a love affair with technology. And there's no question but what it is changing is democratizing news sources. We could all go through the long list of what it's doing that is extremely vital. The Arab Spring could not have happened without the information technology revolution. There's another side that's not getting much discussion yet. Pretty much in the world of philosophy, yes, some academic disciplines. But the question is, what's the impact of technology on what it means to be human? And I'm going to go back to Richard. Richard described to us beautifully a time when Aboriginal people were, in fact, living in their own intact social environmental system in which the meaning of humanness literally had no divisions in it from the rest of living beings and very few divisions in it in terms of disharmony in their own communities. And the impact of a different civilization, so I only ground us there, we saw a living experience of a loss of humanness by one culture's domination of another culture. I think we all need to be asking some questions about the way that we are using technology and the way in which it is ubiquitous and the way in which, I don't know about here, but in the United States, we now have treatment centers for young people who are addicted to their devices. I'm not exaggerating. So the question is, there's something very essential about the phenomenological experience of being a human being. And how, as we're all doing our work, do we actually take that into account in terms, it's been alive and well in this conference. I mean, we feel it, you know it, you're affirmed in it, we talk about it, but in the larger social structure, that's not a very common conversation. Okay, I'm going to stop there and give you a little bit of time at your tables. First of all, you may want to, as I've been talking, some other macro trend has hit your table or someone at your table that you want to say out loud. Please do. But then take a minute, I'll do 5 minutes, I guess, at your table to pick one trend, either one you come up with yourself or one of the ones I've mentioned, and think, I really want to invite you to think big. My belief about the professions we're in, we've come far enough with them, we have enough experience at certain social levels, that it's time for us to start collectively thinking about, if we put our heads together across all the continents, could we contribute to this trend? How could we have an impact on this trend? So, 5 minutes. I know it's not enough, but enjoy. I realize it's not fair for me to give you such a short time. I think there are a couple people who have roving mics. I'm just going to take a couple of tables, I don't know who has the mics. Who has the mics? What I'd like to do is just a couple of tables shout out what trend you picked and either an impact or a contribution statement.
Yes,
please, Amanda.
The trend for people to have the power to make change by doing something small, whether it's a small contribution of money or a sourcing of an idea or a solution.
Terrific. Thank you. Another one.
Hi, we discussed speed. We discussed speed of life as being one of the biggest trends. over the last maybe 5 or decade or so through technology, through migration, through a 24-hour media cycle as well, that the speed is beyond what people can actually cope with and faster than the time it takes for people and communities to connect.
Extremely important. Thank you. Yes, please.
We were talking about technology. You can't put it back in the box, but we perhaps need to humanise it, find ways of making it work on a human scale. That's it.
Excellent. Somebody else? Yes, please.
We talked about the shift in balance. No, we didn't. Sorry. Oh my God. We talked about. Oh my goodness. I can't. Lots of things. We talked about lots of things, but we talked about the is there really a democracy anymore, and how the communities aren't getting to have their say, despite their resilience. So
I think that's a real question, certainly in our country, of is it actually a democratic process anymore? Yeah, please.
We talked about dropping terms like client and patient and consultant and professional and just being people and just seeing if that revolutionises things in terms of reducing distrust and increasing that interpersonal relationship, and also spending less of our hours a day behind a computer screen and actually out talking to people.
Thank you. Somebody else down here.
Similarly, we talked about the bucket of poo dropped on us about institutional trust and how that's a massive hurdle for us to overcome in our work in consultancies, in engagement work. But we saw one of the starting points was about developing local level relationships and connection again.
Thank you. Yes, please.
We talked about how we've almost become victims of our own busyness with technology, and how that actually erodes really opportune moments to build trust with people.
Well said. Another one at that end of the room.
We talked about the tendency for politicians to talk about the necessity to have a national conversation around that, and the fact that we can never find out where the conversations were being held and who was involved.
Actually, that statement is a perfect lead-in to the next part of what I want to talk about. So I'm just going to I guess I have to do one more. Tammy says one more.
We just had an argument about whether glocalization was actually a real thing, which I think's been raised half a dozen times already, so.
Yeah. No, that's a really important discussion. So, queuing off of your statement, and again, I'll speak about, oh, no, wait a minute. I have to do one more thing before I switch. I picked up the newspaper when I arrived here on Friday, and the headline in the Weekend Australian was the announcement about the Nobel Peace Prize. Did you all hear that announcement? So, in the world we live in, I think, particularly in the kind of work we do, we want to note some iconic moments. This is definitely an iconic moment. Tunisia's National Dialogue Quartet last night won the Nobel Peace Prize for building democracy after the 2011 revolution that unleashed the Arab Spring. Tunisia is the only country that has managed to go from the real revolution to a democratic system without going back to more repression. The article goes on to say that the combination of these organizations established an alternative, peaceful political process at a time when the country was on the brink of civil war. The prize is a huge victory for that country. The point I want to make, this is the first time that the Nobel Peace Prize has ever been given to a set of organizations. A set of organizations that chose intentionally to collaborate to begin to build the civil infrastructure necessary to support the bubbling up of the human spirit that created that revolt. Most of the Arab countries did not have the benefit of any combination of organizations who could in fact hold that container to make the transition from the previous governmental circumstance into the capacity to vote for their own leadership. One of the things I think in our field that we need to begin to be more intentional about is the creation of unusual collaborations of organizations to hold and sustain what the citizen voice creates. Did you follow me with that? Usually we think if it's an environmental issue, we'll go back to that set of environmental organizations. A place where you know you've crossed a line that can create potentially a different outcome is when you have a collaboration of organizations that are not the stakeholders we usually identify with that issue. Hugely important learning. You know, I'm sure that John Kerry and whoever his counterpart in Iraq are thought they should have got it. But that would be going back to an old model of identifying individuals. Not that that isn't important, but I think you got my point. Okay. So, what I'm now going to do with you in a much shorter time than I had planned is talk to you about a process that has taken place over 2 years in the United States called Creating Community Solutions, which was created in a response to President Obama calling for a national dialogue on mental health after we in the United States watched another of our now all too regular mass shootings, this time in an elementary school in Newtown, New Jersey, where 20 young children and 6 adults were literally murdered. I'm going to do a pause here to say that the most intelligent commentation I have ever heard on the insanity of the gun issue in the United States is one of your own. How many of you have ever heard Jim Jeffries' rap on the U.S. gun control? If you haven't, you should go to YouTube and watch it. And he's now done this in the United States, in states that are very, very radical about gun control, and has actually created the environment that people can reflect a little bit, and in the way he does it, laugh at the absurdity of where we're stuck. Setting that aside, Newtown was a watershed moment, and lots of us believed and still hold out some hope that it will be one of the steps towards something different happening in gun violence. But in terms of mental health, one of the myths of mental health in the United States, I do not know in Australia, I'm sure you have your own set of myths, but one of the myths in the United States is that mentally ill people are who create most of the gun violence, particularly in these massive shootings. That, in fact, is not real. Mentally ill people in the United States, and I've forgotten the factor, are much more likely to be the victims of gun violence than the perpetrators of gun violence. And yet each time, and there have been examples, the institute I run, which was started when Gabby Giffords was shot, Jared Lochner, who was the perpetrator in that case, clearly was mentally ill. Clearly had been identified 3 times earlier in his life where people knew he had problems, but he never got the appropriate treatment. So it isn't that it never happens, but it's not the dominant demographic of who does mass violence in the United States. President Obama called for a national discussion on mental illness, and I'm now going to go back. I'm sorry I don't know your name. But you said the politicians call for a national discussion, but whoever participated in them? In the United States, it's not an exaggeration that probably a couple of times a month, some issue pops up and somebody calls for a national discussion on da-da-da-da-da-da. At most, it's usually a PR media campaign, but it does not ever really get into the fabric of our community life. Kathleen Sebelius, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services at the time Newtown happened, and Pam Hyde, who was the top political appointee in our agency called Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, actually had the experience. They themselves understood the difference between people really coming together and talking about an issue and therefore doing something about it in their community, as opposed to this, let's paper it over, high level, a few ads, whatever kind of national discussion. Because of my track record with America Speaks, I was called by Pam Hyde and asked to lead the Creating Community Solutions initiative. And we, at the front, the whole field of deliberative democracy in the United States have been talking for some years, actually, about can we find an issue where the major models that have had scholarly research done on them, so everybody knows they actually change participants' behavior, they actually change the policies that are being talked about, no question about that. Could we find an issue that we could work together and therefore use many different methods in different contexts where we were stronger geographically and reach many, many more people? That would be, in our world, a big breakthrough. Because of funding of how this work is done, I have no idea in Australia, but mostly the methods are competing with one another for funding. So here was an opportunity, President calls, can we do a true community-based national discussion on this issue that really has legs? So the groups that collaborated on it, in the end, I'll work through this. In 2 years, more than 300 communities across the United States have actually held this dialogue. We had a 3-tiered strategy, lead cities, which I'll come back to, what we call distributed community conversations, and then youth-focused engagement. This is a fact that anybody in the mental health field undoubtedly knows, but most people don't. At least in our context, 75% of the people who end up with a serious mental illness in their lifetime, the first symptoms of it occurred before they were 15. But the vast majority of them did not get treated until way, way further into adulthood, if at all, which by definition makes it a much more serious situation. So we were particularly focused on getting to young people and what young people need in order to feel support. Now, I think I know the answer to this, but let me just check. In the United States, I've watched this issue over 40 years as an adult, and the stigma about mental illness is about the same today as it was 40 years ago. If my son happened to get diagnosed with brain cancer, the whole community would rally around. They'd probably give us, our family, money if we couldn't deal with the treatments. They'd be there for mutual support for the parents, for the neighborhood. But if my son gets identified with adult onset of bipolar, half of that support kind of disappears. Is that stigma issue that alive and well in Australia? So one of the goals of this mental health discussion, and the President said it, Sebelius said it, we are going to use this occasion to bring the conversation of mental health out of the shadows into the light. Interestingly enough, I don't know if it can hold, but who's leading making that happen today in the United States are young people themselves. Sebelius and Hyde began to hear after a year of this work. They'd go out to a public event, which they've been doing for their whole careers, and young people would come up to them after the event and would say, we don't know what the government's going to do, but we are not going to let this conversation get stuck back in the closet again. So for the first time, again, we don't know if it will hold, but for the first time, there is a shift in the U.S. about the ability to actually have this conversation in a public, meaningful way. Many young people say the first place that they have to stop the stigma is in their own families, that they in fact know they're in trouble, but they're very frightened about speaking about it even with their own parents. So that's what led to the heavy focus on youth engagement. The team of organizations that has been running this project, the organization I lead, Everyday Democracy, America Speaks, National Issues Forum, NCDD, DDC, these are all major deliberative organizations who know each other well. Part of why this worked, part of why the model collaboration worked, was there were relationships between the leaders of each of these organizations with a pretty high trust to begin with. Doubt we could have done it if we were just meeting for the first time. And we did it fully in partnership with the Obama administration. Who was involved? Federal agencies, local governments, nonprofits, faith community, professional association, local funders, networks of all kinds. And one of the big learnings and one of the big outcomes, and this has been true in every community where deep work has been done, if you interviewed the people who did the work, they would say to you, this is the point I was making before, now the accountability is not just being held by mental health organizations. Sacramento County in California, which is the capital of the state and has the most diverse population, huge influx of Sudanese, Somalians. So most people think of California's diversity being in the south in terms with the influx of Hispanics from Central and South America, but in fact it's in the middle of the state and it's a massive difference amongst populations. One of the reasons they are totally confident that the actions they've chosen are going to be implemented to the end is that the superintendent of the public school system is the chairman of the implementation group. Not a hospital, not a mental health provider. One of the big accomplishments in Sacramento. Now, in the United States, when young kids go back to school, they get a physical assessment. Every single general practitioner doctor and hospital-based doctor in Sacramento County has now been trained to do a mental health assessment when kids go back to school. So finally, we're trying to treat mental health as a part of overall health. On a moment-to-moment, I'm going to insert some outcomes of this just to give you a sense of how practical it is and how far it's gone. You can't read this. I'm not going to take the time, but all of the organizations listed on here ended up as official partners to this national dialogue on mental health, and they weren't in name only. If we went through them one by one, they played an actual role in the participation. Might have been, I'm going to go back to this table's comment, which I loved. It might have been a small commitment in their own community, but they actually had skin in the game and were treated as accountable for outcome. The lead cities. We had a very high bar with the lead cities. The mayors had to agree to host it. The community had to raise $300,000 to $400,000 before we agreed to go there. Probably $250,000 of that for the citizen engagement because it was 400 people and completely demographically representative of the community. Several sessions I was in talked about the difficulty of that. The way this was done, if the percentage of the population included 0.75 Somalian refugees, 0.75 Somalian refugees were in that room. In every one of these cities, we did an oversampling of young people by about 30%, so that young people's voices would be very, very strong in the deliberation process. In addition to that, each community had to raise, at least have in the bank, $100,000 for implementation, so that there was no chance the community could come up with the priorities, and then someone would say, oh, you know, we passed our budget already 3 months ago. We'll have to wait until the city council passes the next budget. Or I see the recognition around the room. You've all had that experience. Everybody understood at the outset that $100,000 would hardly touch what needs to be done. I'm going to give the example of Washington, D.C., which is the city I live in. We have this odd phenomena that we are the state as well as the city. In that community, the young people's voice was so strong that the government put in a trust fund $1.6 million for young adults in that community to lead an anti-stigma campaign. They literally are the governance structure running the campaign. There is an organization that's a fiscal agent, all the support you would expect, but the actual decision, the design of the campaign, the videos, etc. A PR firm has been hired to help them, but fundamentally they're running the campaign. The biggest issue, and again, I know a couple of people who are deep in mental health. I don't know how it is in Australia, but I probably won't be surprised. One of the biggest issues from young people's point of view is what we call transition age youth. Young people who hit 18, they therefore are no longer under their parents' authority. They are taking medications for whatever they're taking them for. It's very, very common for them to leave home and decide, I'm done with this. And a huge number of them end up homeless. So services, particularly housing for transition age youth, was a huge part of this work. I just looked at my clock. I'm going to rush on. So the deep work was done in these 6 cities. A 7th city is beginning this deep work, Seattle, Washington, in about a month. For the 3 strategies, remember lead cities, community conversations, and online work, we created materials in partnership with the federal government that were the same no matter what kind of process you did. We ended up doing process designs as short as an hour and as long as 7 hours. But if it was only an hour, these 4 topics were included in a meaningful way, believe it or not. We also created an information brief, a discussion guide, an organizing guide. One of the goals of the deliberative, our group of leaders, was to leave in place a larger capacity in each of these communities to do this work on their own going forward. That's what we see as the next big challenge in the United States. At the local level, at the state level, and frankly, even at the federal level. We have enough examples that we know this works, we know it can be sustained, but we don't have the infrastructure for it to happen on an ongoing basis when people like you and I are not there to run it. So that's something we've added to the challenge. If we're going to be in Sacramento, when we're done, there's going to be more of a capacity in the city of Sacramento. One of the best outcomes in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the mayor actually made a cabinet-level position, first in the country, in the United States, in charge of community engagement. That's the whole portfolio. Okay. If you go to this website, I'm not sure it's completely up to date, but this is how any community in the United States that wanted to be part of this, beyond the 6 cities we led, could come here, could get all the resources I just outlined, and they would get coaching. My favorite story is a small community on the Maine-Canadian border, Milo, Maine. There are 1,000 people in that community, and a housewife and a mother who had a teenage child who had troubles that she was actually worried about his violence. She logged on to this, and she said, over a year, I'm going to ensure that literally every adult in Milo, Maine has the opportunity to be involved in this conversation. And she did it. Another of my favorite stories, completely initiated by the community, was Palm Beach County, Florida. They'd had several instances, this is very common in the United States, where people with mental illness end up being very severely harmed or even killed by police when there are incidents because they have no background or training about. So the decision that community made was to hire several social workers as full-time members of the police force so that every time a call occurred, they would actually go with the policeman to respond. I'm probably giving you more I'm hoping that I'm doing this in a way that you get a sense of the comprehensiveness of it, how much the community's owned it. What I haven't said enough about was the link back to national. To start with, the fact that President Obama called for this was a huge motivator for people to participate. And what they needed, you've all seen this research. If you ask citizens what is the single most significant determinant about whether they will come out to participate in a public process, at least in the United States, it ranks way higher every time. Will it make a difference? Is anybody listening? So we built into the system the capacity for any community of the 300 in the end that did this to know how their material was getting back into the Obama administration. We also built a system for the communities that went far enough that they themselves, and this is a wonderful use of technology, they themselves were connecting both by conference calls and by, I'm moving on, and by actually face-to-face meetings too. Strategy 3, which I have 10 minutes to deal with, Text Talk Act. Young people came to us and said, we want to do more of this. And how we got onto the platform that we created is, where do young people hang out when they're using their devices? It's almost all texting now. Many of them never bother to use email. So we created a platform, and it was based on the way America Speaks used technology, that the platform itself is completely issue neutral. We're using it on mental health, but it could be used on anything. And you can theme. We've now themed up to 20,000 people participating simultaneously. And you can vote on the outcomes. And all you need is a bigger back end to take those numbers higher and higher. So groups of 3 or 4, for Text Talk Act, it was text 89800 and type in START. We had a brain trust that was mostly young people that helped define the questions, that did focus groups for us. We paid youth organizers, we ran contests. The school that signs up the most young people to participate actually won a cash award to do a community engagement process in their school or town. Those of you who've really worked at using online to try to engage people, you know no matter how good your site is, if people don't go there, what difference does it make? So the big deal when you're using this is having lots and lots of partners who have a huge reach into the community. One of our biggest successes is in November of this year, the American Association of School Psychologists, of which there are 25,000 members, have asked us to do Text Talk Act just for them in their schools. So we expect it'll be the largest number that we've ever worked with. This is about a month and a half out of date, but to date, when 27,500 young people have done it, all 50 states, 21.3 million social media impressions, which means other young people cognizant enough of it that they put it out to their network. They may not have answered all the questions themselves. We did an independent evaluation. 70% of the young people say they now know facts about mental health that they could go tell other people. I'm going to stop here to say something I think matters in this room. Those of us who've done a lot of face-to-face work, I am often skeptical of how far you can go online for discussions. We piloted this in a college first and in a high school first. And I will never forget as long as I live. I watched the high school classroom. It was in Oregon. I watched it by Skype. And I then watched the debrief that the teacher did with the young people. The young man that was the quietest during the entire participation time actually was the last person to speak in the debrief. And at the end of it, he said, this is almost word for word, 3 things happened to me in the last hour. I know facts about mental health that I could now repeat to other people. If I saw another student in this school in trouble, I now know 2 things I could do. That's a big, big thing between young people. They see it, but they don't know exactly what actions they can take. And the 3rd thing he said, I now trust everyone in this classroom more than I did before. That means in a 45-minute process, texting and talking in a small group of 2 or 3 other people, we built some social capital among young people. So I think we all have a lot to learn in terms of the current environment about how profound, no matter how short it is, the face-to-face had a big part of it, and the young people say that. It wasn't just me and my device, we talked. But you now have this. You could do this on your own and go all the way through it. You don't need to be doing it with me. But one of the first questions when you get past the video is, how close has anyone in your group been affected by mental health challenges? That's literally the first question we ask. So it personalizes it. People began to share their stories. And then what I was going to do you see the A, B, C, D, you would have selected that in your group. You would have typed, each one of you would have put your letter in, and you would have then, we could have collectively looked at what were the Australian results in this room about that issue, and then we could have compared them to the US results. If I can quickly, I'm not going to do that. Anyway, my guess is it would have been 65% or so would have described it as personally or your families. That would be my guess. So then we would have talked about what actions might you take that would help, and we would have themed them while you went on to other questions, and I would have put up on the screen what were the combination of all the actions everyone in this room felt like they could take as a result of what you had done so far. Is this making sense? And again, you can do this. If you all do it, we can actually still do the results and send it to Michelle or Leanne and look at your collective results. So the last one I was going to ask was particularly to focus on and what you think the country should do, and the young people had very, very specific things for both school, community, and the US. And I want to tell you, in terms of the power of this around the link between national and local, one of the things that young people said, there's a particular training process called mental health first aid. And it was one of the very highest things young people all over the country did. And SAMHSA, the federal agency I told you about, immediately put out an RFA, which is how states get federal money to do this, putting another $3 million into mental health first aid training across the country. So the link between we're doing this and something happens when we do it was very, very palpable.